Welcome to Programming for Cultural Heritage. Today, in this lecture, we're going to talk about reading and writing files and also using CSV files. So when we start talking about reading and writing files, it's very important because we're going to use this ability to open data files and manipulate them, right? So in Python, before you can even start working with a data file, you have to open it in the language, and you have to kind of give Python a pointer to the file and say, okay, we're going to work with this piece of data on the hard drive now and start interacting with it. So the first thing that we need to learn is how to do that, how to actually open a pointer on the hard drive to a specific file using Python and then start interacting with it. So before we get to things like CSV files, which is a serialization for data, we're going to talk about just reading plain text files and opening a plain text file, reading some data out of it or writing some data out of it, and vice versa. So to start using Python and opening files on the hard drive, Python comes built in with a open function. And so this open function allows you to point two pieces of information to it, two different arguments. You tell it what file name you want to open. So where is this file on the hard drive you want to open or create? And then the mode that you want to interact with this file in. So the modes can be write, append, and read. So the default mode is when you use this open command is reading a file. So if you have a CSV file, for example, you would just open this file as read mode and it would allow you to read the contents of the file. If you open that same file in write mode, it's basically saying, okay, I want to write to this file, and the first thing it's going to do is overwrite the whatever's there. So when you pass the write mode, it overwrites whatever's there, and it creates a blank file for you. And then, of course, append is slightly different from write, where it does open up a file for writing to, but whatever you do just adds to the bottom of the file. It appends to the bottom of it. So as an example, let's open up a file and write some stuff to it, right? And so this is the basic syntax of using the open command. You always say with, which is similar to like a other control statement, like the for loop or a if statement, right? So you say with open, and then you say, okay, I want to open this file for this type of operation, and then as X. And here, for example, we're saying open my text file, myfile.txt for write mode as a open file. And in this case, a open file is just a variable. It's storing the concept of that open file, right? It's like a pointer to that open file. And once that file is open in Python, inside of this block of code, right? So you have to indent over. You can start interacting with it, right? And you can say, okay, dot write. It has this write method built into this variable that you just created, and so you can write lines to it as a plain text file. So let's try this, do this together, see if we can get it working. So I'm going to open up my text editor, and I'm going to make a new file, right? I'll minimize my Spotify and make a new file. And so what we're going to do is make a new file, and we're going to save it as, let's just save it in our downloads folder. So I'm going to save it in my downloads folder, and we're going to call it testwrite.py. All right, and so I have this a blank Python file ready to go. So I'm going to say with, and I'm going to say open, and the first parameter you pass is the name of the file you want to open, right? So you could do a relative path, which we're going to use here. So we could just say like myfile.txt. Or if you wanted to open the file in a very specific place on your hard drive, you could say, okay, I want to open it up on users, M is my username, desktop, and then test.txt, right? And that's like the full path of the file. And so that would create a file on the desktop. So if you just have the test.txt or myfile.txt, it's assuming you're going to be opening it in the same directory that the Python script is running from. So in this case, the Python script is saved in my downloads. I'm going to run it from my downloads directory. So it would create a test.txt in the downloads directory itself, right? So depending on where you want the file to go, you could use a relative path like this or a full path with the whole structure laid out of where you want this file to appear on your hard drive. So myfile.txt, and then the second thing we need to pass to it is the type of mode or operation we want to open up that file with. And so we have write mode, we have read mode, and we have append mode. And so when you do these modes, you're just passing a string to the second command, right? So if you say R, that doesn't make any sense, right? It's not a variable, right? So you have to say R as a string, and that's just the way that this open method works. This open function works. So once you have this open part set up, so where you want the file to go, or what file you want to use, and then which mode you want to open it with. And in our case, we were doing a write example, so we're going to open it with a W, so write mode. Then you say as, and then this variable name. So this is the variable name that you come up with. It doesn't matter what you call it. So you would want to use something that's kind of makes sense to you, the same way you name your for loop variable in a way that makes sense to you. So we'll just call it my file or something like that. So we end in a colon, and when we enter down, we're tabbed over. And so any code you write here has this variable my file available to it, right? As soon as you leave this code block down here, it does not exist anymore. So if you try to do print my file down here, it wouldn't work because my file is only defined within this code block. It's very similar to the for loop, where the for loop variable you define is only available within the block of the for loop. So this my file variable is only available within the block of the with statement. But now that we have this there, we can open, we have it open as write mode, and then we can do things like myfile.write, and we can pass something in there to write. So let's just try writing line 1, and let's try writing line 2. And we'll save this. I'm going to go back to the terminal. I'm going to change directory to the downloads folder where this script is, and I'm going to run it, Python 3 test write underscore write.py. Right, and so there's no results because we didn't print anything to screen or anything like that. It just runs. It didn't have any errors. But if we looked in this directory again, so we could say like, okay, is there a file called, and there is, and a little bit more information about it. So it was just made, it's 10 bytes big, right? So we can go to our directory, our downloads directory, and we would see that it's there. And so a little bit maybe unexpected here is that they're not on two separate lines, right? They're kind of mushed together on one line. And so that's just the way that this is working. If we wanted to add line breaks to it, we could use that special escape character /n that we talked about in previous lectures to add a line break at the end of the write statement. So let's add a couple more, right? And try running it again. And this editor just refreshes the file if it's open. So it refreshed the myfile.txt, and now we can see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on a line break, and there's a line break at the end. Okay, so now we are able to write a file out as a text file, right? .txt, and this is just plain text being written out. The next thing we'd want to do is read a file, right? And so to read a file, it's very similar to writing, except you pass the R command instead of the W command, right? And if you don't pass any command, any mode variable as a second parameter, it just assumes you're trying to open something in write mode. So you don't actually have to pass the R, but it's good, just to be consistent. And so what's different about this opening it in read mode is that once it's open, basically it treats a text file like it is a list. And so the thing you can do with the list, right, is loop through it. And so when you open a text file with Python like this, it treats the text file as a list of lines, and you can go through each line and do something with the line. So let's try this together. So I'm going to make a new Python file. I'll say file, new file. I'm going to save this as read test or test read.py. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say with open the name of the file, which is myfile.txt, and I'm going to say read mode this time. And I'm going to store this concept or the pointer to the open file in a variable called myfile, colon, new line indentation, right? And so in here I have my file open in read mode, and when you have a text file like this open in read mode, it's treated like a list of lines. So you could say for a line in my file, print line, right? Or do something with it, we'll just print it. So it should open up this file that we just wrote out and write out per line something, each line that's in that file, right? So let's try it again. Let's try this here. Python test read, right? And so it printed out each line of the file as a loop through it. So you could imagine how this is pretty useful for if you're going to start sharing data, right? So you could write out data to a file, send that file to someone else, and they could read it in and do something with it. And that's kind of the basis of most of the file formats that we're going to be dealing with in our course by opening up data, reading it, and doing something with it. So if we take this idea of a file to transmit data further, we need to be in some sort of format or data serialization. And one of the most common serializations that we'll use or come across is the CSV format. And so the CSV stands for comma separated value, and it's basically a spreadsheet. We've all worked with spreadsheets, so if you can think of what a spreadsheet looks like, there's rows and there's columns. That's basically what a CSV file is. But it's a very simple text-based file format, and it allows you to store tabular data and transmit it in a very kind of easy, open way. And so Python provides you with a module, a little library that's built into Python to read CSV files because it is such a common format. And so we're going to use this module to read a CSV file and do something with it, with the data. And so the module has a reader and writer, just how we just had a reading and writing kind of demo, just using a very basic text file. Because you might want to read a CSV file, which we'll be doing in this activity, or you might be wanting to write out a CSV file, right? Creating a new CSV file. So one thing to kind of keep it in the back of your mind when we start reading CSV files with Python, it basically the way, how we're able to loop through a open text file per line, the same idea is going to be for the CSV reading, except it's a bunch of lines, but each line is its own list. And so if you have a bunch of lines and it's as a list, then you can kind of think of the whole document as a list of lists. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. So this is the basic syntax for using the CSV module. We're going to be importing the CSV module, so you have to import this module first, so that's what you have at the top here. And then the first thing you need to do is open the file, the actual file on the hard drive that you want to read, and then pass it off to the reader. And so this reader, you pass it the pointer to the open file, and it will start processing it and then return that file as a process CSV object or a CSV kind of variable. And so once you have that CSV variable here is called reader, you can loop through it as you would a list. So let's try this at a very simple level. Let's make a new spreadsheet and just kind of give an example of what that looks like. So I just have a basic spreadsheet here. Um, let's continue with the idea of like the pet names and stuff like that. So we'll have, usually the first row of your CSV is like the header. It has the column names. That's usually pretty standard, right? So we'll have something called pet name, pet type, age, and color, right? And so that's the header of the CSV file, and then we would have, um, data for each of the items in the spreadsheet, right? So we'll say Miles is a cat, age is 12, his color is black, and then Bert is a cat, age is say 10, color is orange. We'll have Rua is a dog, age 4. Wait, something like that, right? So a very simple spreadsheet here. And so what we'll do is we'll save this out. We can download it. And so normally you might do this sort of work in Microsoft Excel, right? But you're able to download it also as a CSV file. So download it as a CSV file. I'm just going to rename it here. Download it as name test -sheet 1. So I'm just going to rename it to name_test.csv. All right, so I've renamed the file and we have the CSV file. If we took a look at the file itself in the text editor, we'd see what the serialization format does. Right, so this is the basic layout of a CSV file. It's going to have values separated by commas, and it's that simple, right? One nice thing it does do, so say for example, if one of these names had a comma in it for some reason, right? What the CSV format would do, it would encase that value in quotes, because you can't have commas in a comma delimited file because it'll think you're delimiting the file and not just having a comma. So the things like that, the CSV writer in Python will take care of for you automatically, so you don't have to think about it. That's why you probably won't want to write your own CSV manually, even though you could. You'd rather just use the CSV module because it knows about these standard things and it does it for you automatically. All right, so that's the file. That's the CSV file that we just created. So let's make a new Python file, and we're going to call it CSV test. Leave it in my downloads folder, test.py. And so, like we saw on the slide explanation, the first thing you're going to need to do if you're going to work with the CSV file is import the CSV module. So you're going to say import CSV. And the CSV module comes built into Python and knows exactly what you're talking about when you say CSV. It loads that library up. And now the CSV is a variable that has all these things built into it, all these methods built into it that you can now access in your program. So once we have that imported, the second thing we're going to do is open the actual file itself, the CSV file. We need to load it into memory, and then so we can pass it on to the CSV library to process. So we're going to say with open and the name of the CSV file, which is called name test.csv. We're going to say open this in read mode, right? And then we're going to say as, and we'll just call this name CSV file, or we'll call it name file. And so once that is open, then you can pass the variable where the ID of the open file is stored off to the CSV processor to process it and turn it into a readable CSV file. So let's look at our slides here. So in that case, you say, okay, you have the variable and you pass it off to the CSV reader and it processes it and returns it as a file ready to go as a CSV data file. So we'll say, okay, CSV file, or we'll say processed CSV equals, and we'll say CSV, so that's the module that we imported, the library that we imported. And we'll say dot reader, and reader is just a method that's built into this library that reads CSV files, and then we simply pass the name of the open file to it that we've opened. In that case, it's called name file. So this CSV library will do its thing, and then it will return the process CSV file back to you, and then you can start looping through it. You can say for row in process CSV, print row. And so now it's going to return the whole file as a list of lists, and you can start looping through them. So let's see if it worked. And this is called CSV test. Right, and so it went through and it loops through each line and it returns it as a list. And so if you can imagine what this would look like kind of internally, you'd have one list, right? And then each one of those lists is something like this. So it is a list of lists in kind of the way that it's structured in Python. So when you're looping through this first for loop, you're looping through each one of these data items is actually a list, and you're looping through it, and each one of those represents a row in the file. So if you wanted to print out the first column of each row, you would treat this like a list, right? And you say which index piece you wanted to use, right? And so that just prints out the first column in each row. Some things to think about. So let's print out 0, 1, 2, the second position index, which is the third column, right? So in our file, this represents the age. And so one thing to note here is that CSV is not cognizant of data types. It turns everything it has into a string. So while these numbers look like they're age numbers, there should be numbers, they're actually strings that are in your program now, because the CSV module doesn't know how to parse different data types in the file. If it sees a number, it doesn't know it's a number because it's just a text file, so it brings it in as a text string. So everything in the file is a text string. Another thing is to see how it's always printing out this age thing, and so that's usually we want to kind of skip that, right? We don't usually want to work with the age or the header pieces of data. And so what we could do is we could quickly kind of look up how we would get over that. And so, there's a couple ways we could manually do it, right? We could check to see like, oh, if the value is equal to age, then skip that one. But let's look up really quick, Python CSV, skip first line, right? So a lot of programming is knowing how to kind of structure a question and ask the internet. All right, so let's look at these answers here that they have provided. So Python, skip header row with CSV reader. That's exactly what we're doing, right? We want to skip the header row. And so they're saying, okay, here, very similar to our little program that we have already. Let me make this larger. It's saying we have like, okay, import the CSV module with open the file as files. And then you just say they're defining the reader and they're reading it. And then they just say reader, next reader, none. So this is their answer that they're providing here. You can skip the first row by just saying next and then the process CSV file, and then this none as a second parameter, and it will skip over the first one. So let's try that in ours. So what we can always do is just copy and paste and then replace the pieces of information that belong to us, right, or is different for us, right? So in their example, they called their process CSV file called reader. In our example, we call it process CSV, so we'll just put that there. And that's really the only change we need to make, right? The second parameter is just none. It's just telling the next function how to what it should do, and so we can leave that as none. And then if we save this and run this again, we can see that it is skips the header row, right? So using this, we can do whatever we want to do with the data in it, and access different pieces of it as we iterate through it. The only reading method I want to talk about for reading a CSV file is that the CSV module, right, that we've imported has different options for reading and writing. And the one option we just looked at is the very basic option, very straightforward, simple option. But it also comes with a different type of reader, a CSV reader called the dictionary reader. And so this is just going to give a quick example of using the dictionary reader instead of the regular reader. And so what the dictionary reader does is that instead of importing your CSV file as a list of lists, it imports the CSV file as a list of dictionaries. So that'll make a little bit more sense in this minute. But to get started, we're going to just do the same thing that we did for the regular reader. So I'm going to save as this new file as CSV dict reader.py. So we're going to import the CSV module again. We're going to open up the our test CSV file again. In this case, we called it name test CSV. Now we're going to open it in read mode, right? As let's call it name test. And so now we can use the same CSV module, but a different method that's built into it, not the reader, but the dictionary reader. And so what we can say is processed CSV equals CSV.dict reader, and then we pass the open file to it. So that will process the same file, but a little bit differently and return it a little bit different data structure. And so what we can do is say, okay, for row in process CSV, print row, but instead of using the index numbers, right, we can use, it's treated the CSV file as a dictionary now. And so it's used the header names as the key values of the key value pair. So now we can use, instead of 0, 1, 2, we can use the actual header name. Let's see if it works. And it's called CSV dict reader. Right, so it's a little bit different now. It's not a list of dictionaries, or it's not a list of lists, it's a list of dictionaries. And that will make, and we didn't need to skip the header row or anything, because now the header is actually used as the key value pair. So there's, Python, there's many ways of doing things. You might find this a little bit easier because you don't have to keep track of the index positions of the header columns. But if you know the header names, then this might be a little bit more straightforward to parse a CSV file. This week, the challenge is going to be doing some work with the CSV file, reading a CSV file. And so to do that, we need a repository or some access to some CSV files. So this week you're going to pick a CSV file from one of these sites, the Open Data for New York City, or there's a dataset search feature at Google, and you're going to download one of these CSV files and try to iterate through it and do something with the data. So you can look for patterns in the data. You can add things together. Um, it really depends on what type of data file you're working with and what's interesting about it. So basically, you probably want to try to do something with a CSV file that is a little bit more complicated, that you something you can do with just basic Excel, right? So let's take a look at doing this challenge. So if you want to give it a shot before we review it, so pause the video now, and then you come back and see how we do it together um, to get started. So we're going to use a CSV file. So we're going to go to one of these sites to grab one of the data files available. So I'm going to use the Open New York City Open Dataset site. And so these basically has a huge range of CSV files being generated by the government of New York City. So let's go to the new data sets and see what we got published recently. Just looking through here. So this could be interesting. Open restaurant inspections. So this is open restaurant inspection data set contains records on site setup inspections performed throughout the 5 boroughs. So let's look at it. It was published last month from when this video was recorded. And so this site provides a little bit of a preview of the data that you can expect to find in it. And so it has 19,000 rows and then 12 columns. And it looks like the rows are basically information about, it has the borough name, the restaurant name, the seating choice. So this is a file looking at restaurants that set up seating in the street for the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it has their address, and then it has their kind of results if it's roadway compliant. So this is looking at restaurants that have taken advantage and set up a dining area in the roadway, and then it's saying, is it compliant with the government specifications or not? And it has the dates and the person who, or the agency that inspected it. So this sounds like an interesting data set, right? So we're going to go up here and say export, and then say export as CSV. So that's going to download for us. And if we opened up that file in our text editor just to see what it looks like, we could so open restaurants inspection CSV, and this is basically what it looks like. So of course it has these headers at the top, and then each row has the same information. All right. So to get started, let's just open this file up and start looping through every line. So there's 19,000 lines. And let's just try printing out the restaurant name. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to save it as CSV restaurant, or we'll say CSV roadside parse.py. And so to get started, of course, we're going to do what we do for every CSV file. We're going to import CSV. We're going to say with open the name of the file. So that's the name of the file that I downloaded. And then we're going to say what mode. We'll say read, and then we'll say as, we'll just call this data file, something simple. So we have indented here, right? And then we have available to us the open data file. And so what we need to do is parse that file as a CSV file. So we'll say processed CSV equals CSV.reader. And let's use the dictionary reader since we've already tried that. And then we just need to pass the name of the variable that the file is opened as, so it's data file. So that's up here as data file. All right, so now that it's open, it's available to us and we can loop through it like a for loop. So we'll say for row in process CSV, and let's just try printing out the name of the restaurant. So that's under the key restaurant name. So we'll say print row restaurant name. So let's see if it works. 3, this is called CSV roadside parse. Right? So it went through and it printed out all of the names of the restaurants that were in the file. So let's say we want to make a list of restaurants that were not compliant at some point in their history. So we would need to check, do a couple things, right? We would need to, let's go back and look at the data. We would need to say, okay, whenever is roadway compliant set to non-compliant, if that's the value for that column, then we want to add the name of the restaurant to the something, right? Keep track of it somehow. So now we have two things we have to figure out how to do. We have to figure out how to test for a value to see if it's something, and then we need to figure out how to add it to some sort of data type to keep track of it for later, right? So first thing is let's just see if we can get it working so we can test to see um, if it's compliant or not. So we need to, instead of printing out that restaurant name, let's print out that key value pair for if it's compliant or not. And we'll see the results here. Let's try running it. Right, so we have a couple options here. So this is always the problem with when you're working with data, right? So you have compliant, under review, skipped, non-compliant, and then you have something nice like this, not registered uh, and non-compliant. So it's not just one or the other. It has this, and this is just treated like a big string, right? So you are gonna you'd have to go through here and check to see if there's any sort of gotchas like we just saw there. But let's assume that this data is very clean, and then the only option would be non-compliant, compliant, skipped, or something like that, right? So what we can do is we can test to see if this value is equal non-compliant by writing an if statement, right? So let's only print this out if it is equal to the value that we want, right? So we'll say if row is roadway compliant is equal to non-compliant, right? Because this is a string. Then print it out, and we'll tab it underneath of this if statement. So this will only happen if this if statement is true, right? So let's try running this again, and we should just see only non-compliant things. All right, so we know that worked. And so now the only thing we need to do is have some place to store this data, right? And so what we could do is thinking about how do we want to store this data or save it for later. Because if you think about this way this is looping through the CSV file, you only have access to that row of data at that one time. And if you want to save something for later, you got to put it somewhere else. Otherwise, it will be gone, right? So let's just do this two ways. We can say, okay, I want to save the names of all the restaurants that are non-compliant. So if we're going to say, okay, save the names, that's a list of data, right? So we're going to need a list to store this data in. So we'll make a new list, right? And so we'll make a new list called NC, non-compliant names. And we'll say equals an empty list. So you can define your own list, right? If this was a list of numbers, it would look like this. if it was a list of strings, right? But you could also just leave two square brackets, and now you have an empty list. It's just nothing's in there, but the variable is defined, and you can use it. And so what you can do is every list has a method built into it called append. And so what append does is it adds whatever you pass to it into the list. And so instead of printing out here, we can just change this from print to dot append. And now instead of printing it, it's going to append whatever you pass inside these parentheses into the variable, the list variable. And so now it's going to append the names that are non-compliant, right? Because this is only going to happen if this is true. And then once it's done, it should be all the names of non-compliant restaurants should be in there. And so one thing you want to make sure though is that this is a block of code that's happening with this data file being open, and this is a block of a for loop that's looping through the entire data file, right? So if you wanted to see the results of this, say printing out the screen, and you print out the results here, it's going to print the name of it's going to print all the names of non-compliant restaurants on every loop of the CSV file, so 19,000 times, right? But if we unindent it, then it removes it from that flow of the code, and we can unindent it all the way to the beginning. And so basically, by unindenting it and putting it at the bottom, we're guaranteeing that this will happen the last thing in the program, and it will only happen once, right? Because it's not in a for loop or anything like that. So let's give it a shot, see what happens. Okay, so it printed out on non-compliance and this nice staircase pattern here. And so the problem is, right, yeah, it's not compliant, and we added it to the list, but we don't want to add the name of we don't want to add non-compliant to the list, we want to add the name of the restaurant, right? So we're adding the wrong key here. We don't want to add we don't want to add not the status, we want to add the name of the restaurant. So that's stored under restaurant name. So let's give it another shot. Right, and so now we see a bunch of restaurant names. And so you can say like, okay, I wonder how many are in there. And so you could actually come in here and use the len function. We talked a little bit about that function earlier in the beginning. And this basically just counts the number of things that you pass to it. So if you pass it a string, it will count how long the string is. If you pass it a list, it will count how many things are on that list. So 4,700 non-compliant restaurants. The only other thing I would say is that if you look at this example of the data file, you can see for some of the restaurants there is actually multiple inspection dates, right? Because it might have been inspected at a certain time. And so you would have, if they were non-compliant twice, like this restaurant was, the Diamond in Brooklyn, was non-compliant twice, and then it was non-compliant twice more. So this is it actually added the Diamond name in there 4 times, right? Because it was non-compliant 4 times, and there's 4 rows, and it doesn't know if it was in there or not already, so it added it 4 times. So what you could do is add another if statement, right? To say, if this name is already in the list of non-compliant restaurants, don't add it yet, right? So what we can do is actually add another if statement here. So it's going to get to this point because yes, it's non-compliant, but then we're going to test to see if this name is already in the list that we have made. So that's as simple as saying if the restaurant name for this row, right, is not in NT names, then, and then we have to indent it, add it, right? So we have 2 tests now. It says, okay, if it's non-compliant, and if the name that we're about to add is already not in the names, then add it. And so if we save this and run this again, we should see a significant decrease in the number of restaurants, non-compliant restaurants, right? So there's a lot of duplications in there. So this kind of removed that problem of having duplicate names in there. So that's pretty cool. Another thing we could do is, there's a lot of research questions we could think about this and ask ourselves. And so we could say, okay, I want to know which borough is the best or is the worst compliant borough in the city, right? And so you could say, okay, so I need to um, have something new here, right? So I still need to keep track of which restaurants are non-compliant, but now I want to keep track of what borough that they are part of and keep track of how many are non-compliant. And so what you could do is, think about this in many ways. Um, you could have a Brooklyn variable, right? So that would be my Brooklyn counter. And then I could have an if statement here to say, okay, add it to the names, but also if the borough name is Brooklyn, then add one to that. And then so you say Brooklyn equals Brooklyn plus one. And so the counter will go up, right? So that's one way of doing it. You could do that. So you could define a counter for each borough. Um, Another way of doing it is thinking about this key value pairs, right? So what if you had a key value pair where the key is the borough and the value is the counter, right? And so what you could do is say, okay, I'm going to, instead of make um, a variable for each borough, I'm just going to have a borough variable, and we're going to make it an empty dictionary, right? Because we're going to have the borough name as the key and then the counter as the value. So to start off, we're just going to have an empty borough dictionary. And so what we could do is, make sure that we know what the right name of the borough is stored under. So it's stored underneath of this variable called borough. So let's make sure it's printing here. All right, so we're able to print it out. And so what we can do, right? So we have this is going to be the key, and then the value is going to be a number, and it's going to increase as we go. So the first problem is we can see by the way we define it that there's no keys already, right? It'd be different if it was like this, and we define this to 0, and that might work, but sometimes, with the data, maybe there's lowercase b's, that's a different key name, etc. So let's just start with an empty dictionary. And our first problem here is if it gets to this point, then we know that's a name, it's a new restaurant that's non-compliant that we have not added yet. And so we need to say, okay, is this key already in our dictionary yet? And if it's not, make it in our dictionary. And then the next thing we're going to say, add one to it, right? Because it's a non-compliant restaurant in that borough, so we want to increase it by 1. So we can test to see if this key is actually in our dictionary yet. So we can say if the borough is not in the borough variable, let's change this to borough count just to be a little bit more clear, then do something. And so similar to, you can check to see the kind of owner, to see if a item is in a list. You can check to see if a key exists in a dictionary already by using this in chest. So, if we had it say in borough count, then this would only happen if the current borough name was actually in the borough count. But since we're saying not in, it's only going to happen if the borough name is not in the dictionary already. So if it's not in the dictionary already, then we can say something like, okay, our borough count, square brackets, and then this is going to be the key of the key value pair, right? And so the key of the key value pair is going to be the name of the borough, right? And if that's not in the list already, then we want to make it in the list and set it equal to 0. So now the borough in our key value pairs in our borough count variable now has a key that represents this value that's in this for this specific borough. and it's set to 0, right? And then the last thing we want to do is increase it by 1. And so basically that's what this does. We say, okay, we know it's there because if it wasn't there, we created it, and now we're going to increase it by 1. So you could simplify this too, if you wanted to make this more readable to yourself and you don't like having these like extra nested variables and dictionary names, you can actually make this simpler on yourself because you can define whatever variable you want for yourself. So you could make a new variable called borough, or we could call it like this borough name. So that's a new variable, and we'll set it equal to the current row's borough name, right? And so now we could actually go through and replace all the places we used that before with this new variable. This borough name, this borough name, this borough name, this borough name. And we'll get rid of this print statement. So it's the same thing, right? You're doing the exact same thing, either using the whole kind of like address to the dictionary for that row, or you are just kind of defining your own variable name and reusing that. So whatever makes more sense to you and makes things easier to keep track of. So if we did this right, so it should only get to this point if the restaurant has not been added to the restaurant names yet. So it's a new occurrence of a restaurant not being compliant. Then we're going to say, okay, we're going to store the name in the borough. Then we're going to test to say, like, is this borough name already in our empty dictionary? And if it's not, then create it and set it equal to 0. So that will only happen when there's a new borough name, this part. And then this last piece will say, for every borough name, make a addition, add +1 to that existing tally, right? So let's try printing it out. So at the very end of everything, we're going to print borough count and see what happens. Oops. So according to this data, we could see that Manhattan is the most egregious offenses of non-compliant roadside dining. So of course, this is just, you'd have to do a lot more work to think about, the number of restaurants in Manhattan versus the other boroughs, what's the percentage, et cetera, right? But this is just something a little bit more complicated that you wouldn't necessarily easily do in Excel, right? You can imagine once you're at this point, you can make it even more kind of verbose and have many more checks and do other sorts of kind of cross lists and comparisons and stuff like that to really get at the data that you're trying to loop through. So that's an example of a little bit more complicated challenge. So if you feel kind of okay with this process, I would say you're in a good place. The main thing to keep track of is when we're talking about CSVs is looping through it and then kind of testing data and doing some sort of operation with that data. But until next time, thanks, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.